So today's speaker is Dr. Robert Budnitz. He is on the scientific staff at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where he works on nuclear power safety and security and radioactive waste management. From 2002 to 2007, he was at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where he worked on a 2-year special assignment in Washington, D.C. to assist the director of DOE's Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management to develop a new science and technology program. Prior to the Lawrence Livermore National Lab in 2002, he ran a one-person consulting practice in Berkeley for over 2 decades. In 1978 to 1980, he was a senior officer on the staff of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, serving as deputy director and then the director of the Office of the Nuclear Regulatory Research. From 1967 to 1978, he was on the staff of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, serving in 1975 to 1978 as the associate director of the lab and the head of the Energy and Environmental Division. So let's welcome Bob on this very interesting talk today.
I got 2 mics here about a foot apart, and I've got to fix that. Okay, that one's out of the way. Okay? Yeah. And I don't need this. I'm going to stand to the side of it. Okay, welcome. I can tell there's a lot of interest in this topic. I've given this talk before, and there's a lot of interest in this topic, and I'm going to try to explain 2 things. As it says, what happened and what does it mean? Now, I can't possibly explain what happened in detail. It would take too long, but I'll try to give you the outlines of what happened and also couldn't possibly explain what it means because that's in the future, and none of us really know what it means in detail, but I'm going to try to give you some overview of that too. I'm in the presence of a whole bunch of nuclear engineers from just across the other side, so I'm not going to get into great detail about the nuclear engineering. Again, it would take more than I could do, but I'm going to try to give you the basic outline of what happened and why it happened. So now, hold on. It's probably that one. No? Yeah. Is that the one? Right. That goes back. Okay, it's that one. So just to start, nuclear power is very important in Japan. It generates about 1/4 of their power. They have nuclear power plant sites all over the main island of Honshu and also in the southern and northern islands too. And as you can see, they're on both the east coast and the west coast. This reactor complex was on the east coast, on the northeast coast of Honshu, quite a long ways, a couple hundred miles north of Tokyo. I'm not exactly sure about those numbers, but it was too far away from Tokyo to have affected Tokyo very much. And there are altogether 50-odd units on a whole lot of different sites. On the northeast coast, there are 6, 10, 13 units that were affected or one way or another by this very large event. It says 14, I guess. It says affected by the tsunami. But the ones at issue are the 6 in the middle at what's called Fukushima 1. Now, I want you to notice that just south of Fukushima 1 are 4 more units at Fukushima 2. Very close, just a few kilometers away. They are not identical, but very similar to the ones on the site that was damaged. And because they retained capability to have off-site power, that off-site power wasn't lost there, those reactors weren't damaged. And we can go and look at those reactors, and have. And a lot of the lessons about what happened and what didn't happen at the accident are understood because of going to look at the other ones. So there are 6 reactors on the site that got in trouble, and serious trouble, and you can see where they are. I'm just going to go on to the next slide and explain. This is an aerial view. And the 6 units, the oldest one in 1971, they were all built in the 70s. The first one is small. All the others are quite large. The 2, 3, 4, and 5 are 760 megawatts electric. That's about 2,000 megawatts thermal. And then the last unit is bigger still. But crucially, only 3 of them were in operation. If all 6 of them had been in operation, there certainly would have been more trouble. But only 3 of them were in operation. The other 3 were in outage. There are outages from time to time for refueling, but in this case, the outages were of longer duration because they were doing some after all these years doing some upgrades and repairs and so on. And crucially, Unit 4, all of the core was out of the reactor and in a spent fuel pool. And that's a very important thing we'll come to later. The other three, though, 1, 2, and 3, they were in operation, and all three of those suffered a very serious core damage accident, the likes of which we've only seen in a light water reactor once before in our history, and that was at 3 Mile Island, where the core melted. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, as everybody probably knows, the proximate cause of this was a tsunami. Tsunami caused by the earthquake. So I'm going to talk about that just briefly. I've got a picture. It's not a very good picture, but it's sort of a picture of Japan. And look at the left-hand picture. Now, the stuff up above, don't worry about. I'm not skilled enough to have figured out how to erase it. The tsunami break, the earthquake break that caused the tsunami, was 400 kilometers long, more or less, sort of north to south, not quite, but north to south. And it was 75 miles offshore. And there's a picture of the tsunami just after it started to happen. Now, you have to understand how this tsunami worked, because it was a slump tsunami. Our earthquakes in California go like this. They go strike slip. But there, because of the subduction zone phenomena, it was a slump. And over the whole 400 kilometers, which is more than 250 miles, there was this slump. It wasn't uniformly the same amount all along, but in the middle, it was a huge slump over 20 meters. If I talk in metric, you'll have to figure out that over 20 meters is 60-odd feet. And if you do that in your bathtub, you get a lot of waves. I mean, you get a big wave. And there was a wave. This picture shows it went both ways, of course. The one that went east ended up, it came to our shore here on the Pacific coast of North America. And the other one went the other way. And this wave was a huge tsunami, and it was caused by that earthquake. Now, of course, the earthquake motion got to the mainland right away, because it's traveling at sonic velocities, and the tsunami is traveling at wave velocities. The time between when the earthquake got to the mainland and when the wave got there was about 45 minutes, 45, 50. It varied a little from one to the next, but that's the time. And, in fact, it says it there. What does it say? 1446 and 1538. So you can work that out, right? 50-something minutes. In any event, it's the tsunami, and then that other picture shows as it comes close to shore. It's the tsunami that is the cause of this accident, not the earthquake, although the earthquake caused the tsunami. Now, I have learned in the last several months that most people who haven't thought about this and don't know much about it think that the tsunami is a big wave. And there's this very famous picture, Hokusai, a very famous Japanese artist about 200 years ago. In fact, it's one of the most famous graphic pictures in all of art. Everybody in art recognizes it. That's not what a tsunami looks like. It's not a wave like that, even though that's what a lot of people think. In fact, that wave, which is what surfers surf on, has nothing to do with this tsunami phenomenon. What a tsunami is, because of this big slump, is way out in the ocean, is it causes a wave that more looks like that. This is my own handwriting. Imagine this wave is going from left to right, and depending on the height, in this particular case out in the middle of the ocean, the middle of that thing might have been 10 or 20 meters high. And if you had a ship shown on top of that, that's the same scale as ships. The ship would ride up and ride back and wouldn't see too much about it. But it's going that way pretty fast. And when it comes up to the shore, that's where you get these huge, what we call waves on the shore, because the shore has a slope, and the size of the wave and the run-up and the size of the water inundation depend on the local topography. But it's the tsunami impacting the shore that's the key problem. But notice, if you're on the shore, it doesn't look like this wave. It's a rise in the sea level that takes place over many seconds. It's not just one thing. It takes place over many seconds, a rise in the sea level, and then it goes back down. And that can last for tens of seconds, and then it goes back down, and of course goes the other way, and there's a whole lot of damage caused by that. Now, at the plant site, the height of the wave that rose was 14 meters. This slide says estimated more than 10. This is an early slide, but it turns out we now believe that it was more than 14 meters. And you notice the blue line is where the sea level, the normal sea level was. They had anticipated tsunamis here, and they had built a wall that was about 6 meters high. 6 meters, about 19 or 20 feet. And of course, it was more than twice that. 14 meters is about 40 plus feet. And it just completely went over it as if it didn't see it. But it wasn't, as I said, a wave hitting it. It rose up above it and just rose up above it. And it impacted, as this picture shows, it impacted the front building as the turbine building. But the water actually went around the buildings to the other side and kept going for some ways because of how high it was. And the reactor building was tight to the water, but the turbine building wasn't. Water went inside. And the crucial design flaw of these reactors, the first crucial design flaw of these reactors, is that the diesel generators were in the basement of the turbine building. Now, I'll describe why that's important in just a minute. You see, the earthquake caused the loss of offsite power. The grid went down, and these reactors, like all reactors, depend on the grid for electricity. It runs all sorts of stuff. But because we know that the grid isn't 100% reliable, all reactors are required by design and regulation to have on-site power so that power is available when the grid is lost. And that worked here. There were 2 diesel generators in each of these 6 units and a couple more besides. There were 14 diesel generators, I understood it, on that 6-unit site. And they all started up right after the earthquake. And that's just as designed. And if there hadn't been any water, things would have been safe. So that's good. I mean, they started up fine. They survived the earthquake just as they're designed to do, because they're designed for earthquakes like this. But the water came and knocked them out. Okay? The reason why units 5 and 6 didn't get in trouble was one diesel generator, Elbert Unit 6, actually survived, provided power, and saved units 5 and 6. All the others were lost, and the reactors got into a blackout meaning no AC power at all. And that's what caused the accident. I'll get into more about that, but first I want to talk a little more about the tsunami. Now, I got this slide from somebody else, and I can't read Japanese at all. But along the bottom are a whole bunch of sites from north to south over about a 300-kilometer distance from north to south along that coast. And I can't read this, but what I was told was the big red dots are the size of the tsunami height at that spot, going from north to south. And all the other ones are the sizes of various seawalls that were built. They had harbors, they had industrial facilities, they had towns. And you notice they built a whole lot of seawalls, and a lot of them were 10 meters high or even 15 meters high. So they knew tsunamis were coming, and a lot of them were 5 or 6 or 7, you can see. The different squares and triangles are different kinds of facilities. But you can see that pretty uniformly from north to south, the tsunami was way bigger than they had anticipated. And that's the fundamental failing. It wasn't the reactors failing alone. 26,000 people are dead because of that failure. And the Japanese are concerned about it, as they should be. And it wasn't just the reactor at all. Now, just going north to south again, I got another picture. Oops. I guess I didn't. Okay. To shorten it up, I had another picture that showed a little more about this. But that's the lesson for you. 26,000 people were inundated by this thing. By the way, as I understand it, they had 45 minutes from the earthquake till the tsunami came. They have tsunami warning system. The horns went off. More or less 400,000 people evacuated successfully. 26,000 didn't. Less than 10%. It was kind of a successful evacuation. They got imagine it, less than an hour. 400,000 people were saved. 20-odd thousand weren't. They got left behind. Some people were old. Some people weren't mobile. Some people got confused. Various things. But it was actually quite a successful evacuation when you consider they did all that in less than an hour. But those 20-odd thousand people paid because of this, paid with their lives because of this failure to predict how big the tsunami was. Okay, let's get back to the reactor. As I said, the tsunami came to the reactor site, completely swamped those diesel generators, caused all sorts of other havoc, by the way, and the earthquake had caused some trouble on the roads and so on too, and all sorts of havoc on the site. The loss of power was the cause of the accident I'm going to explain, but a lot of other damage also ensued. Crucially, even if the diesels had run, the diesels produce power that has to go somewhere in the site. It's a distribution system, wires and switchgear and control systems and the like, and most of that was damaged also it survived the earthquake, and most of that was damaged by the tsunami also. So even if the diesels had come on, they weren't going to distribute power. Again, because It was damaged by the water. They were below the height of the water, and the cause of that was that blackout. So let me go to talk about a boiling water reactor, and then we're going to get into some reactor stuff here. This will be stylized. I can't do much more here. But if you understand a boiling water reactor simply, it's a way of boiling water to make steam, makes electricity. On the left-hand side is a large pressure vessel with reactor fuel in it. And when the chain reaction runs and the control rods are out, they come in from the bottom, and the control rods go in and it cuts the chain reaction to stops it. The chain reaction boils water. It goes out that line, the light blue line, as steam, goes to a turbine, drives the turbine. About a third of the energy in that steam makes electricity. About the other 2/3 doesn't because of the efficiency of the thermodynamic process. And the rest of that is waste heat. It goes down out of the turbine, down to a condenser here, which is shown. And then it gets condensed back to water, and there's a pump, pumps it back inside, and goes around a loop again. The condenser, in turn, in this case, goes to the sea. That's how the ultimate heat sink for this cooling is. And about 2/3 of the energy in the chain reaction is going out to the sea. And as you can see, there's a generator. This is stylized. There's a generator that goes off to wherever the load is, in the grid. So that's very stylized. But just to explain a couple more things about how this works. The fuel consists of fuel assemblies. There were over 500 of them, and an assembly is shown there. It's 12. The active area is 12 feet. The active height is about 12 feet high. It's about this big around these boxes, and consists of 64 8x8 fuel rods. It says 62 because there are a couple of control rods and other instrument tubes in there, but it's 64 4x4, and each of those fuel rods on the left, 12 feet long, has a whole lot of little pellets that look like aspirin tablets, kind of. That's the uranium fuel, uranium oxide fuel that's in there. And the fuel rods then, 33,500 assemblies, comprise this great big machine. And if you want to know how big that is, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. This is a huge, huge pressure vessel in a huge, huge building. Next, I'm just going to go on and show you. Now, just to show how big it is, this is a reactor very similar to the large Fukushima, the largest of the Fukushima reactors. This is under construction in Alabama. This is a TVA plant under construction in the 70s. And to show you how big this is all going to be inside the building that you're going to see got damaged. So this is how big this thing is. That great big donut at the bottom, which we call the Torus, or the suppression pool, I'm going to come to later. That's the containment structure, this thing that sort of looks like a light bulb. And the lid of it's down here in front. And just to show you what the scale is, there's a woman sitting right up there on the edge. But I don't know if it's a woman. But you can see a person sitting up there. So this, you just see how big this is. This is a huge, huge building. Next picture. Oops. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah. Oh, no, I got one more. Here it is. Now, here it is stylized. This is containment that sort of looks like an upside-down light bulb. And it has these channels. There are half a dozen channels to this great big Torus at the bottom, this suppression pool. And up above is a spent fuel pool I'll come to in a minute. That's, when they refuel, they take the fuel out of the reactor core and they put it in that spent fuel pool. That's that pink thing that's stylized in the fuel. And it stays there for a few years while it cools down radioactively and thermally before it can be moved. And the way this is designed is this large inverted light bulb is the containment. That's designed to retain the radioactivity if the reactor and inside the pressure vessel gets in trouble. Okay. This large Torus I'll talk about in a minute. Let me keep going now here's a picture of it. Remember how big that picture was with that woman sitting at the top of that thing? Well, this is inside that building. And there's the cranes and stuff. But this just to show you, in the reactor vessel is that long thing that's sort of red or ochre colored there. And this is just a way, this is a GE picture, just a way to show the kind of scale of these things. Next one. And here's the spent fuel pool, empty, way up in the top of the building. It looks like a swimming pool, except it's about 30 feet deep. And it's probably 50 feet on the side. And the reason it's 30 feet deep is those things are 12 feet long, the spent fuel, and they're sort of 15 or 20 feet underwater as they're stored there. Now, here's the normal operating configuration before they got into trouble. And I saw this before, but this has a little more. The reactor in the middle boils water. The steam goes out that red line going to the turbine. The turbine spins, the generator makes electricity offsite. Okay? Then the exhaust from the turbine goes down to the condenser, which condenses, that's the seawater condenser, and this red pump pumps it back into the reactor. All of that's, the red pump and so on is run by electricity, and that's the normal operating configuration. And the electricity that runs this also comes from the grid. But if you lose the grid, the diesels, which there's a diesel shown up there, the diesels are supposed to run all this stuff too, and in fact, they do. Although when you lose the grid, you shut down just as a safety measure. So let me go on. Whoops. Oh, no, I got to back up. Whoops. So here's what happened. They lost the diesels. They had lost the grid. There was no on-site electricity at all. The reactors are actually designed to be safe for some time, even when that happens. The way they're safe is that there are other systems, I'll describe it in a minute, that can function to keep it safe for a while, even when you lose electricity. Now, here's the crucial thing you need to remember. The problem with a reactor is that even when it's shut down and the control rods are in, it generates a whole lot of heat. It decays gradually, but in the first moments, it generates a whole lot of heat, many percent of the primary power, because there's a lot of thermal energy and there's also a whole lot of radioactive decay heat inside the core. And that heat, sitting there, would boil the water in the reactor right away. So in order to keep it safe, you've got to keep putting water into the pot. And as long as you can keep water in the reactor, in the pot, and keep it covered, and remove the heat that it's generating, because that's going to generate some heat, it will be safe. And the principle, after shutting the chain reaction down, which happened here and is not generally a problem, the principal design problem for reactors to keep them safe is making sure that the water never goes down so the core is uncovered. That's the thing you got to do. That's the main thing in these reactors that keeps them safe, the loss of which causes trouble. So, as long as there's electricity, even when it's shut down, this works fine. Actually, at a low enough power, it doesn't go to the turbine. It bypasses it to another system because they're not making electricity when it's shut down. But it goes to the condenser. It's going around, keeping water in there. It's fine. You lose electricity, AC power. There is, in fact, and this is by design, a system in these reactors that can keep water in that pot, keep putting it in, even though there's no AC power. And I'll describe that here. There's this very large suppression pool, that great big Torus that I showed you, a lot of water. And there's a pump shown in green, which runs on the steam that the reactor itself is making. The reactor's making steam. Some of it's bled off, drives the pump. And as long as that steam is there, and as long as that pump's running, and as long as there's water in the suppression pool, the green path injects water into the core. And as long as you can keep doing that and remove the decay heat, why the reactor's underwater and things are safe. Now, of course, in this configuration, with no place for that steam to go, where does the steam go? Well, there are valves at the top of the reactor, relief valves at the top of the reactor, that go out, and the steam that's generated by this, remember it's underwater, we hope, with the green system. The steam goes out the top and goes back down into the suppression pool, this great big Torus, where it is condensed, and then the water is available to keep going around. Of course, as you do that, that suppression pool is heating up a little bit. And if you do it forever, that suppression pool is going to heat up too much. So there's only a certain amount of time in which this system will work before you've got to find some other way to get water in there or some other way to remove decay heat. So there are systems to remove decay heat from the suppression pool, but they need power. The power was gone, so the suppression pool was heating up. So this will only run for a certain number of hours before you get in trouble. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But as long as this green system is working and the steam is driving that pump, why this thing remains safe. But here's the problem. If the green system stops, you're not putting any water in, the level goes down very fast because it's boiling. And right away, in just no time, I mean, an hour or two, the core gets uncovered, and then you get in trouble really fast. And the trouble goes very fast. I'll describe that in a minute. And you get, and the core melts, and you really cause a serious problem. So The crucial thing about this green system, this injection system that runs on steam, is that it too needs electricity, but it only needs batteries. The control system for its system requires DC power, batteries. So the reactor is equipped with these very large battery banks. They kind of look like automobile batteries, except there's hundreds of them ganged together that produce DC power to provide control for these systems. And the way the reactor got in trouble was that they couldn't restore AC power. They couldn't restore any AC power. The batteries ran out. The injection system stopped. And they lost level. And the core melted. Okay? That's really quick. It's a little more complicated than that for one of the units, which has a slightly different system for it. But ultimately, all three of those reactors that were running had that scenario. They couldn't inject because the batteries ran out. And in one of the others, unit one, it was a little different, but this is the sort of general scenario. And the cores melted, one after the other. But remarkably, in unit two, that green system, which we call reactor core isolation cooling, lasted for 20 hours. And in unit three, it actually lasted for 70 hours, almost 3 days, which is longer than people speculated it could have. But these designs are predicated on restoring some sort of power, and they didn't restore the power. They couldn't restore offsite power because of the earthquake. They couldn't restore the onsite power because the diesels were swamped, and even if they weren't, the distribution systems from the diesels were swamped too. So knowing that now, we can look back and say that when the tsunami caused the trouble it did, they were going to get a core damage accident in all three of those sooner or later, and it happened sooner in one, medium for another one, a little later in the other one. But by 3 days, all three of them were in trouble. All three of them had a level decrease, and the cores melted. Okay? Now, when a core melts, there's a phenomenon which is really another thing important for you to understand. I won't go into gory detail, but I just want to sort of describe it to you so you'll see, see this idea. Here's a stylized picture that sort of a cute thing shows, well, the batteries ran out. Okay? And it killed that green line, and they got in trouble. But let me keep going. What happens when the water goes down below the top of the core? It isn't even all the way down, is the core, the fuel rods are made out of uranium, but they're surrounded by a zirconium cladding, which is chosen for its neutron properties and its other mechanical and metallurgical properties. But as soon as this happens, and there's a lot of steam around, and it's hot, it's just hotter than the blazes, the reaction I've shown takes place with the zirconium. Zirconium reacts with water, oxidizes to zirconium oxide, releases hydrogen, and crucially, it's exothermic, which means that that reaction creates more heat, which drives the reaction more. And once it gets started, it's really hard to stop unless you pour a whole lot of water in there, which they didn't. So gradually, it gets up, it heats up and heats up and heats up. I said the uranium eutectic actually melts at that very high temperature. That's a very high temperature, but that happened here because they lost level, and then they finally got up there. But that's the source of the hydrogen that caused trouble, I'll talk about in a minute. But as this reaction proceeded, and they lost the zirconium cladding, the pellets there, they look like aspirin tablets, they crumbled, and gradually they collected in the bottom of each of these reactors as a rubble bed, a pile of rubble. Now at 3 Mile Island, about half or more of the core did that. This was 1979 in Pennsylvania. And a certain fraction of the core remained intact up at the top in these channels, and the rest of it was a rubble bed at the bottom. And I have to say that today, here at 7 months later, we don't really, 6 months later, we don't really know yet how much of the core is at the bottom, how much of the core is still there. But we know a whole lot of it's at the bottom of each of these three. So let me go on. Metal-water reaction here releases energy, makes it go faster. The core slumped. It's at the bottom of the vessel. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Here's a kind of a stylized picture of this sort of debris bed at the bottom of the lower head of the vessel. We don't really know that it looks like this. This is sort of a stylized cartoon picture, but that's sort of an idea. And of course, if you can't keep that rubble bed cool, it will ultimately damage the steel vessel, which is 8 inches of steel, and will go down through outside the vessel and go into this lower containment. As best we can tell, in 2 of these 3 reactors, there's been some compromise of the vessel at the bottom, and we don't really know. Nobody knows how much or where, but we think that only one of those 3 vessels is still intact, although we don't know for sure. Now, This is a rubble bed, but if it gets hot enough and there's no way to get the heat out, it sort of becomes molten. Here's a picture of molten pool. We call it corium. That's sort of a joke, but a jargon in the industry. But here it is before it has melted, and here it is after it's melted. This is a molten pool, which is hotter still because there's energy from the decay heat and so on continues if you don't remove the heat. And this sort of phenomenon is at the bottom of each of those three reactors, Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3. Again, we don't know, the community, the Japanese themselves, they don't know how much it is. We have some speculations, a whole lot of indirect evidence, but not really knowing how much of it's melted, but we know it did in all three. Now let's go back to this picture because I want to show you a couple other things. Okay. If that happened, and it did at 3 Mile Island, essentially no radioactivity got out of 3 Mile Island because it stopped. Injection was restored. That core stuff at the bottom was cooled. It was molten and then solidified at the bottom. The vessel wasn't compromised, and almost nothing got out except a little bit of radioactive gas. But here, we know a good deal got out. By the way, several percent. Not 10%, but several percent. And some of it was gas, and some of it was liquid. And I'll describe both, and then I'm going to go on. Some was gas, and some was liquid. I mentioned to you that when the pressure inside the primary vessel gets too high, there are relief valves. They go back down to the suppression pool, where the suppression pool, this torus, is supposed to condense, and does condense as long as it works. But if they're non-condensables, hydrogen is an example, but CO2 also, they're non-condensables. Why they're not condensed, and it pressurizes that. And so there's a relief system that's supposed to relieve that and relieve it to the outside. Okay? But that system, in fact, didn't work properly, and nobody is really sure why. And that system actually relieved the hydrogen not to the outside, but to this, but to the building around it. The hydrogen in Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3 built up in the building, and in 1 and 3 actually caused these large hydrogen explosions that you've read about. In Unit 2, it didn't because by a fluke, a window-sized thing, maybe a few meters, about the size of this ceiling panel, blew out of the side of the building. I'll show you in a picture in a minute. And vented it so it didn't accumulate enough to explode. That's our interpretation of what happened there. But in Units 1 and Unit 3, there was a very large explosion attributed to hydrogen. And here are pictures of Unit 1. There's Unit 2 with the hole in the side. And by the way, you want to know how big these buildings are? Remember that great big thing I showed you with the woman sitting on the top? They're inside here. These are big buildings. These are 6- and 8-story buildings. And Unit 3, they had an explosion too. Okay? And that came, we understand, from the hydrogen. Okay? Now, we had a really tough dilemma. The whole nuclear engineering community around the world had a tough dilemma trying to understand what happened at Unit 4. There was no fuel in the reactor at Unit 4. It was all the fuel in the core was in the spent fuel pool. It blew its top off. For more than a month, all of us were convinced that what happened was the spent fuel pool lost water level because they couldn't restore it, and they had an explosion due to that. That was our scenario. More than a month later, Japanese went in there, looked at the Unit 4, all the fuel's in the pool, it's all underwater. That wasn't so. Our best understanding is that the explosion in Unit 4 came because hydrogen from Unit 3 somehow came across, collected there, and caused that explosion. We're not sure exactly how that worked. There are lines, there are gas and vent lines connecting them. Perhaps that was what it was. It seems very unlikely, but Sherlock Holmes said that if you ruled out everything else, the unlikely is it. That was sort of the idea of this quote. That was in Baskervilles, and so we kind of think that that explosion here was not the spent fuel pool, but hydrogen coming from Unit 3. But you can see that building has been destroyed too, even though the spent fuel pool there, with all the core in it, is intact. Okay, let me go back, just to talk about this for a minute. I'm going to now talk about the water. In 3 Mile Island, there was no release of anything except gases outside the reactor vessel. Here, early on, there was radioactive water that escaped from the primary. It escaped actually this light bulb thing, went into a turbine building, went into a trench, and went into the sea. I'm sure you read about that if you paid attention to the news. and contaminated the sea. It was a percent or two of all the radioactivity, which is not trivial, but it's not, as huge as it might be. And to this day, no one is really absolutely sure how that path went. But the best explanation is that there are blue lines here. You can see two of them on the side of this reactor vessel. In normal operation, those are pumps, recirculation pumps, those blue pumps, run on electricity. And they recirculate water in normal operation just to keep the water in there from becoming stratified and keep it stirred up, sort of. And it's probably the flanges in those recirc lines that failed. They shouldn't have. We don't understand why. The design shouldn't have. And let that water out. None of us know why that is. No one's been able to go in there to inspect to see why. But that's probably the scenario. Now, if it happened in some one flange somewhere, we'd say, oh, that was just something bad. But it happened in all three units. So it's more systematic than that, if that's what it is, and it's the sort of the scenario we think. So just to recoup before I go on with the implications. The water pathway that way into the turbine building, ultimately into the sea, was a little more than 1% of the radioactivity. The airborne pathway that went out well, after the buildings exploded, there wasn't any way to hold it, but it went out those airborne, was several percent. It varied from one unit to the next, but less than 10 in every case. One it was 4 or 5%, one it was 6 or 7%. And just to contrast that with the accident at Chernobyl, which in 1986 was a very different design, a Soviet design in the Ukraine, there it was way more, a higher percentage than that when airborne. This is a far smaller release, but nevertheless it contaminated a whole lot of the countryside. So before I talk about the implications, I'm going to go back and explain, just to recoup what happened. They lost offsite power from the earthquake. 45, 50 minutes later, the tsunami came, knocked out the onsite power, the diesels. That green system kicked in, ran for a while, until the batteries were exhausted. Then they lost level in each of the reactors, and each of them melted. Okay? It's just as quick as that. Now, the melting, had they been able to restore some water, would have stabilized, and they wouldn't have had these releases. So, as perhaps you know, and one other thing to say, they struggled. They didn't have any other sources of water on site. So ultimately, they decided to inject water from the sea. They brought in mobile fire trucks. They ran fire lines to the sea. They took seawater, they injected it into the vessel, and finally stabilized a few days later each of those three reactors with seawater. And that stopped what would have otherwise been a continuing progression until they got some sort of water in there. And that was a wonderful thing to do because it stopped. But then, because seawater is corrosive, they had a long-range problem for 3 months trying to gradually get the seawater out of there and replace it with fresh water as other sources came in. Okay? A couple other things. They tried to bring in emergency power right away, but they didn't get it in time. And when they did, they couldn't distribute the power because the distribution systems from where the diesels distributed had been destroyed by the tsunami too. So they had to actually run separate lines to all the different loads rather than have a distribution place to do it because that had been destroyed too. Okay? They didn't get the on-site power, they didn't get that off-site power in time to prevent the cores from damaging, but they could have stopped things earlier had they not had that problem. And then one other thing to emphasize. As best we can tell, the earthquake didn't cause this reactor, this trouble. As best we can tell, everything functioned fine after the earthquake for the first 45 minutes. There are 4 reactors just a few miles south, very similar to these. And because they kept on-site power, they weren't hurt. A thorough inspection of those 4 has been done, and they don't see anything that looks like it's seismic caused damage. So the general feeling is that the seismic design of these stations was adequate. And that's nice to know if you're a seismic engineer, because that's not where the issue is. The earthquakes here exceeded the design basis by a little bit, but everything performed fine in the earthquake. There are a lot of little stuff, but nothing serious on the safety side. And so I'll just leave you with those last couple of things. And now I'm going to talk briefly about the implications because I'm running out of time. So let's talk about the implications. And I can tell you, I'm about as good at predicting the future as anybody else in the room. which is I can't even tell you what I'm going to do a week from Thursday. Maybe I do. Nobody really knows. For sure, there are fundamental problems with what happened there that have to be fixed not only here, but perhaps at our reactors too. Until some of the things that I mentioned are understood better, we're not going to know whether some of those problems affect our reactors or only affect theirs. We're not going to know whether they only affect theirs on that site or theirs elsewhere in Japan. We're not going to know whether they affect just that design or other reactors out of that design. Probably some of each. So all around the world, different task forces have been trying to understand these things and trying to get to the bottom of what lessons there are. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had a task force for 90 days that issued a report that I can tell you how to find. And came up with a whole lot of lessons, of which the most important is that we really have to be sure that all of our reactors can survive a blackout like that for a lot longer than some people thought. By the way, we have reactors out in our country that can only survive a blackout for a few hours. Others that can survive for a very long time. A blackout meaning loss of AC power. Others for a very much longer time. And that's a fundamental lesson. And the second fundamental lesson is we have to be sure that the design basis for our reactors for things like these very unusual large natural hazards is really much stronger than the Japanese had here. As best we can tell, that particular site has had 2 or 3 tsunamis roughly this size in recorded history in Japan. Not really sure, going back in faded history, but it's probably many hundred-year recurrence, roughly. And we're really adamant in making sure that our reactors are designed so that the sort of event that occurs like that shouldn't come around except every 10,000 years or even more remotely than that. So we're confident that we have a better design than they had here, but nevertheless, another lesson is to go and look, and that's going on in the U.S. now. So let me just go briefly to the U.S., and I'll talk about the radioactivity, and then I'll stop and ask questions. We have 104 reactors in the U.S. I think it's 104. Yeah. 23 of them are Mark I boiling water reactors, designed by GE, by the way, General Electric. They're pretty similar to this. I mean, they're different in detail, but pretty similar to this. And most of our reactors are old. There's an age distribution. Most of them are between 20 and 40 years old, not too many younger than that. And these 104 reactors produce about 20% of the power in the U.S., averaged over a year. Now, I want to talk about doses before I come to the Japanese dose situation, and then I'll stop and ask for questions. I hope you understand the significance of these doses before I go to the Japanese doses. But this is a typical dose in the U.S. Averaged over the whole population in a year. And we measure dose in rem, or in this case, millirem. The natural radioactivity on the left-hand side comprises about 300 millirem per year. It varies from place to place. In Berkeley, it's a couple hundred. In Denver, it's 400. But that's an average over the U.S. And a lot of it comes from rocks and soil, but some of it comes from cosmic rays. And the human body itself is radioactive in various things. And then we get some from food. And the other half of our exposure today, 300 odd, is because on average, everybody in the country gets about 300 per year from medical. Now, you may not have got it, and somebody else is getting 800. But that's the average. And the average in the U.S. is about 620 millirem per year, of which about half is natural, and the other half comes from medical. And in fact, there's a little bit from consumer products, and not very much. It's about half and half. Now, I want you to keep that 300 and that 600 in context when I go to the next slide, because we're going to describe about how much radioactivity there is in Japan. Okay? This is a picture from about the 1st of April. And so it's not, you don't look at the numbers in detail because things have decayed. But this is to show you, and there's the site up there, this is to show you where the radioactivity went. The circles there are 20 kilometers, about 12 miles, 30 kilometers, about 18 miles, and 80 kilometers, about 50 miles. And on this particular, by then, at the end of March, all that had been dispersed airborne. And what I want to show you here is the distribution. Do you see the yellow area, the sort of orange area, and then the sort of yellow area that goes northwest of the site and goes out to about 15 or 20 miles? That's the area of significant contamination. There's rather less contamination in the area that's kind of green, and less still in the area that's kind of blue. And by the way, these blue lines here are flight patterns of a particular aircraft. I took this off the web just because it was a convenient way of showing showing the, where the radioactivity went. And although they evacuated they evacuated this very large area out to 30 kilometers, which is the second of those 3 circles, they evacuated the whole area. Reoccupation is possible in all but that area that's sort of orange or yellow. Now, the Japanese have selected as their criterion for reoccupation that if at a particular spot the radioactivity in a year is 2,000 or more, they're not going to let people back in until they clean it up. If it's less than 2,000, and remember, the natural background's about 300, and then you get about another 300 for medical. And if you live in Denver, you get twice as much natural stuff, and so on. So there's a range here. But they've selected 2,000 as the criterion, and they are now in the process where they can of reoccupying the zones that aren't in that nasty area that goes north and west. Now, that area has about 40,000, had about 40,000 population, and those people are out of house and home, and they're going to be for a long while. Because a lot of those homes can't be cleaned. They're going to have to be taken down and the radioactivity buried and rebuilt, although some of them can be cleaned, and a lot of the soil there can be cleaned, and some of it can't be. The Japanese have a very major program now, a half a year later, of figuring out what to do and going out there and starting to do it. And in the meantime, reoccupation is starting in the rest of that zone. So the impact of this is that although a couple of 100,000 or more people evacuated originally, about 40,000 are stuck out of house and home. Now, just to put that in context, 10 times as many as that lost their homes to the tsunami, or their businesses, or their place of work. You've seen the pictures. They look like my childhood game, pickup sticks. 10 times as many lost their homes, tsunami. 26,000 died. But about 40,000, I'm not sure the exact number, because they're doing it now, and people are assessing who can go back and who can't, are going to be out for a while. The recovery from this is liable to cost many tens of billion. Recovering the reactor is thought to be between 10 and 20 billion, just cleaning it up. 10 and 20 billion for that complex. And several times that to recover all the rest of this. But the damage from the tsunami is going to cost them almost 10 times that again. So the economic impact is the tsunami. The human impact is the tsunami. Of course, the headlines, unless you live there, are the reactor, which is fine. We understand that. And there was rather little came down south. If you're living in Tokyo all that time, you really didn't get anything that mattered. So I'm going to leave you with this slide and stop and take questions. But before I do, I just have one thing really important to say about the implications. None of us know, besides the safety improvements that are liable to be required, and I hope urgently at the plants that need them, none of us know whether this is going to have a long-term impact on the deployment of nuclear power in the world. We just don't know. In our country, or in Japan, or in Europe, or the new countries building. And we can't know, because predicting the future is still a few years before this plays out. Okay? And as it plays out, a whole lot of it's going to be economic, and a whole lot of it will be justifiable, fear of radioactivity, because look what happened. And a whole lot of it is just going to be the interplay between various other kinds of electricity in this. So I'll close by just saying I'll stay as long as you want to answer as many questions as you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll open the floor to questions.
And I went over.
Thank you. Just a clarification. If you can go to your last slide. I just want to clarify my understanding of the last slide.
Sure.
That green area, not the teal, not the yellow, green area, quarter to 1.19 millirems per hour.
Oh, by the way, that's the dose on April 3.
Okay.
That's not the dose now.
Okay.
I just put this up to show the geographical area. Okay? I said this slide was on April 3 or maybe April 4.
Yeah, okay.
It says it down here. Yeah, April 3.
Okay, but thank you. So perhaps it's declining. Presumably it's declining.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Okay. But if that's one on average, let's say the green area, just on average, maybe I'm a little pessimistic here, is 1 millirem per hour?
No.
Well, it's 0.25 to 0.1.
No. That was then. No.
Well, at that time.
No, the green area is outside. The green area's got to be roughly outside the 2,000 per year.
Well, let me ask my question first.
Okay, so 2,000 per year is the criterion where they're not going to allow to reoccupy, and that's sort of the orange, and the yellow.
May I ask my question?
Sure, of course.
Thank you. If we take the average, just round numbers, 0.25 to 1.19, just call it for the sake of argument for the moment, 1 millirem per hour?
Right.
All right, so that's 24 millirem per day?
Or 8,000 per year. Go ahead.
Exactly, that's my point. I just want to clarify my understanding.
Yes, sir.
Because the limit, as you pointed out, the natural, or the limit they've set is 2,000. That's
Yeah,
what I
so,
wanted to clarify.
by the way,
Thank you very much.
a little less than 9,000 hours in a year, so yes.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for your thorough presentation today. And on that slide also, the last slide
sure.
there, you know, I find that it's not an even comparison, apples to oranges.
I screwed up. Go ahead. Of course it's not.
When you're talking about the tsunami event and the number of people that were affected and the evacuation and the death rate, and then in the case of the nuclear material escaping into the environment, because the tsunami, of course, is a short event that only takes place in a certain amount of time, in hours, but the cesium that was the bulk of what was released, you know, has the effect is through the food chain and the people for 100 years, roughly?
For sure.
Is that right?
For sure. The cesium-137 has a 30-year half-life, and the cesium-134 has a 4-year half-life. That's right. I mean, I didn't mean it to be anything but just to point out that there are 26,000 dead from the tsunami, and there's no way that anything approaching that can possibly happen from the radioactivity. It's just not. You can't conjure a scenario in which you purposely fed this to people to kill that many. It's just not, as bad as it is. Okay? Sasha?
There was some talk after the accident about speculation that there had been a recriticality accident in spent fuel pool number 3.
Correct.
And the alleged evidence was the distribution of isotopes of fission products.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that? Has that been disproven? Or?
Yes. Yes. The evidence by looking in those pools has told us that isn't so. Okay. There was not any recriticality in any of the pools. None of them lost level. There was always plenty of moderation of absorber. Okay. But we didn't know that at first. You bet.
What are the new standards likely to be in terms of backup power in the future?
The NRC has asked our NRC has asked every reactor to do a new assessment to make sure that the reliability of what we have on every single site is what is claimed, and to assess what upgrades might be appropriate. And you ought to know that within a few weeks, our nearest plant, Diablo Canyon near San Luis Obispo, brought in another diesel of a different kind and has had extra arrangements to make sure that the fuel can be assessed, and that's going on around the country. So it's now case by case, and the NRC is likely to have a rulemaking to establish different criteria. But how that's going to play out is still a few months away. Okay.
If the place is designed to create energy, why is it necessary to have external grid energy to power the place?
Because after you shut the reactor down, which is when you need it.
Okay.
Okay. You can't use.
But it's still generating heat.
Yes, it's still generating heat, but that heat doesn't make electricity, and you don't want it to. You don't want the operators to be. It just doesn't work.
Okay. Thank you.
Within almost no time, there's nothing to drive the turbines. Yeah, go ahead.
I've heard it said that one of the reasons Fukushima 2 survived better was because the reactor designs were more modern. But from what you said, it just seems that you think it was just because they didn't lose on-site power.
They weren't more modern, actually. The last one came out in '79, and like a lot of ours, there hasn't been a lot of modernization. By the way, they've replaced specific pieces of equipment. You know, there's better electric distribution systems. There's better cabling. The fire protection system is new. But the fundamental design is from the 70s. Okay? They're not more modern. We have really wonderful modern designs, but we haven't built any of them yet here.
So are you saying with the spent fuel pools,
Yeah.
that the way they were designed implies that the ones we have in the United States, even the one in Vermont that has an enormous amount of spent fuel, is probably safe, or something
No.
that the NRC is going to be looking at?
No. The way a spent fuel pool gets in trouble is because there's heat in the core, that's the fuel, and it could boil the water off if you can't you got to take the heat out with a heat exchanger, and or you can do it by boiling, but then you got to keep putting water back in. So the design is to assure that those pools always have water in there. That depends on the reliability of those systems, especially after an event like this, rather than just the regular sitting there every day and it might be unreliable. I mean, that happens too, but these events are a principal cause of trouble. And although the NRC has said, based on analysis and understanding, that our current pools are safe for now, I'm going to bet you a nickel that there's going to be some improvements. I'm sure to win this nickel. There's going to be some improvements that are going to be put in everywhere, even though they're thought to be safe, just because it doesn't cost much to have a whole lot of extra margin. Okay?
Hi, I have a question too.
Sure.
I think during that time I read some article that was saying that they should have pumped in the seawater earlier.
Yes.
That they were sort of trying not to, because it's sort of like a last resort thing.
Yes.
And it would be extremely costly as well.
Yes.
Is that something that could have been done much earlier and
Yes.
thereby helped a lot?
Well, no. I don't think in any of them they could, well, maybe in Unit 3 possibly, which was the one where Rixey lasted for almost 3 days, that they could have got seawater in there in time to have saved the reactor core. But had they put seawater in earlier, they could have had less trouble, less damage, more heat taken out, made them cooler. And this goes to a very difficult problem with the Japanese decision process. As I understand it, and I think we now understand it, we understood it early on, but until the Japanese owned up to it themselves, we were very careful not to accuse them of anything, but they've owned up to it themselves. All these plants have procedures for all sorts of things. And if you're in the control room and there's a procedure that you're supposed to do, you're required to follow those procedures. But in Japan, if there's no procedure for what's happening, the control room operators aren't empowered to take action on their own. They have to ask supervisors, in this case, Tokyo Electric Power headquarters in Tokyo, and TEPCO. And the TEPCO people, although they had the authority, didn't exercise that authority without asking the government. And that took there were two different times in which, one has to do with venting and another one has to do with seawater, in which many hours were lost seeking that authority. Now, everybody that's thought about this now understands that's a terrible situation, and the Japanese have now taken steps to reverse it. Let me describe. I flew from Chicago yesterday, and I got to tell you, if the plane gets in trouble, I want that pilot to be empowered to take whatever actions are necessary to save that plane. Now, we want the pilot to get on the phone and talk and get advice if there's time. We want the pilot to seek other opinions. Of course, he's got a co-pilot and so on. But the power to do what's necessary is in the hands of that pilot. And in our reactors, it's in the hands of the senior operator in the control room. The control room has 5 or 6. The senior operator can do whatever is necessary in that person's judgment to save the reactor, whatever it is. In Japan, it's not so. They had to go outside. They lost precious time. And between you and me, and they know it now, that's dumb. I mean, it's just, had they thought about it in advance, and they now understand it, and they're feeling very bad about it, although it didn't cause the core melts, remember? That happened anyway. But they lost precious time on a couple of occasions because they had to seek approval outside the reactor site for things that the people inside knew. There was one case in which one of the senior operators took an action. He asked for authorization, hadn't come through yet, he did it anyway, risking his life, his pension, his job, and shame, okay? And saved one of those reactors more trouble. He's now a hero, but you don't do that. It's really hard. It's hard for us. It's even harder there. But that happened once, and now they have, they say, changed that so that if, God forbid, anything like this happens again, the person in the control room will have the authority. Okay?
Bob,
Ehud.
a comment.
Ehud Greenspan from the Department of Nuclear Engineering. Yeah.
Yeah, very important to know that nowadays we have reactor designs that are called passively safe, meaning that they can maintain their safety without having to rely on any power from the outside or
Correct.
from the inside. They have the means to remove the decay heat passively. And we hope that such advanced reactors will be developed to be commercial and will be used in the future.
Yeah, by the way, it's not only a fair comment, but if you're a nuclear engineer like I am, an exciting one. But let me describe. Everybody in this room, I hope, understands that the modern aircraft are way, way safer than the ones that were 40 years old. But I came yesterday on a 737, and I felt safe enough. But I can tell you, those brand new planes are way, way safer because they're 30 or 40 years of better controls, better materials, better this, better that. They're just safer. And commercial aircraft accident rates have gone down and down and down and down and down. So they're a factor of 100 safer than they were when I was a postdoc. But we're still running the old ones, right? I came on a 737. By the way, it's better than the old 737s. It's got a whole lot of this new stuff, but it doesn't have all of it. These reactors are old. A lot of upgrading has been done on them and the ones like them. But there's no way that these reactors have the features that Ehud just described. Professor Greenspan in nuclear engineering is working on, along with several other colleagues here and elsewhere, working on a whole lot of clever designs that if we could deploy them, would be immune from a whole lot of this trouble. Doesn't mean they can't get in trouble, but a whole lot of things are just won't happen.
Actually, as a fairly direct follow-up to that, I was struck in your talk the number of times you said, we thought we understood something and now realize we really don't.
Yes.
And so
it's pretty humbling,
I'm curious,
by the way.
well, so I'm actually curious about what this incident tells us about the limits of our knowledge and how we should build that into how we think about nuclear power for the future.
Fair enough.
So that we're not in 10 years saying, well, we thought we understood these passive systems perfectly and thought they were safe, and then whatever accident happened afterwards.
I agree, and in fact, our designs are intended to have backups for the backups, okay? And mostly that works very well. We've had hardly any. We've had hardly any big accidents, but it doesn't always work, and the problem is that the engineers challenged to identify and overcome something like this, which is we call a common cause failure. A whole lot of things were caused by one thing. And we think we've done a good job on all that, but you never know, and anybody that would say otherwise is just more competent than engineers should be. But, there's a lot of evidence to tell us that these reactors are actually pretty safe. In fact, let me tell you something interesting. I am convinced that the fleet of 400 light water reactors out there today, with the exception of a few in funny places that don't know what they're doing, is these reactors are way, way safer than they were 20 years ago, the same reactors. A whole lot of safety improvements have been built in, operator training, learning from experience, fixing things. Something happens over here, it fixed everywhere. I'm absolutely convinced of that. I can show you the evidence. I gave a talk about that a year ago about why our reactors are safer than they were. Now, I want to tell you, that's still true despite this, in the same sense that if we had a plane crash tomorrow, it doesn't mean that the fleet of planes isn't safer than it was 20 years ago. It is. Okay? It's not perfectly safe, of course, and that's our trouble. We're worried about that. I'm a nuclear engineer. You bet. It's deeply troubling. But on average, there's absolutely firm evidence, and I can show you, about all the things that happen that don't happen very much. And just to cite one piece of evidence, if you've got a minute to explain. Back at the time of 3 Mile Island, this is 30 years ago. Well, let me back up. Whenever some small thing happens in any of these reactors that reaches a certain threshold, there's an automatic signal, or the control room operators are told to scram the reactors, put the rods in and shut it down. Okay? Back at the time of 3 Mile Island, every reactor in the U.S. had one of those about 10 times a year. the average over the whole country, about 10 times a year. We had about 100 reactors. There were about 1,000 of them every year. Where some went wrong, reactor had to be shut down. They figured out what it was, they fixed it, and so on, okay? Now, by the middle 80s, that had decreased to where it was about 1 or 2 per year per reactor, okay? Last year, there was a handful in the whole country, okay? A handful of times in the whole country, less than 10, I think, in which something, and by the way, what went wrong isn't a safety problem, it's just prudent. It's as if, you know, you're driving a car, taillight goes out, you shut down and fix it. You don't drive to the garage, you shut down and fix it, right? Things like, I don't mean that's so trivial, but it's not. Taillights are important for safety. Things like that prudently demand a shutdown, and the number of those mostly minor things is a handful a year. And it was 1,000 at 3 Mile Island. And at 3 Mile Island, I was a full-grown, grown-up professional, I can tell you, right? I was 40, and, you know, I thought I was, you know, a full-grown professional. And I got to tell you that in 30 years we've done that. How do we do it? No one thing. 600 little things. Fix this, fix that, train this, don't do that, observe that, pay attention to this experience. Look at that thing that happened over here. Make sure it doesn't happen to you. Whole lot of little things, and they're safer, just as aircraft are. Plus advances in materials and computers and controls and all that stuff. So, sure, they're better. Are they perfect? No way. Can an accident like this happen again? You bet. Is it likely? No. Could it happen tomorrow? Yes. What's the probability? Way less than we thought. Way less than it used to be. Is this higher than we thought? I don't know. Who would have thought that they would have put reactors at a place where a tsunami this big was going to come along every few hundred years? We didn't understand that. I'm sure they didn't. Okay? Who would have thought?
One last question.
Never mind.
Okay? So we're pretty humble, I got to tell you. It's really tough.
Well, Bob, thank you for a great talk.
Sure.